It was worth $200 on paper. Everyone laughed. Nobody wanted it. And they all walked away. She took it because her grandfather had asked her to. The lawyer put on his glasses with the precision of someone about to say something important, opened the folder on the table and waited for the murmur in the room to die down. It was almost 11 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, and the office of attorney Harlan Meade smelled of old coffee and aged paper. That specific smell of places where decisions are made without ceremony. Vivian Whitfield was sitting in the last chair on the left, her bag on her lap and her hands folded over it, watching her cousins settle around the oval table as if this were a business meeting, which, at its core, was exactly what it was. Ernest Whitfield had died 23 days earlier, on a September morning, at 86 years old, in the bedroom where he had slept for decades. Vivian had gone to the funeral. The others had too. They had embraced in the church parking lot, exchanged the usual remarks. He lived a long life. He was at peace. He didn't suffer. And then each one returned to their own life. Now they were there to hear what he had left behind. And the mood in the room was not one of grief. It was one of expectation. Douglas Whitfield was seated at the head of the table, which no one had arranged, but no one had questioned either. That was how it always worked with Douglas. He occupied the primary space without asking permission and without anyone feeling the need to challenge it. 51 years old, gray suit, well-cut silver hair, a lawyer for nearly 3 decades, partner at a respected firm, a man who understood the difference between what the law said and what the law allowed. He had helped organize the estate, coordinated the documents with Attorney Meade, and had arrived that morning 20 minutes before everyone else. Vivian had noticed all of this without commenting on any of it. Attorney Meade began with the house where Ernest had lived, a modest property in a small town that would be divided among the direct heirs after expenses were settled. Then came the bank accounts, a total balance of $42,000, minus taxes and fees. Then a vehicle 12 years old, then some pieces of furniture with sentimental value distributed by name. The room grew quieter with each item, not out of sadness, but from the silent arithmetic that each person there was running in their own head. It was then that Attorney Meade turned a page, adjusted his glasses again, and said, in the same neutral tone he had used for everything else, "Finally, a rural property registered under the name of Ernest Whitfield since 1973. Total area of approximately 32 acres located in Harwick County, about 150 miles from here. Declared value in the cadastral record, $200. There was a 2-second silence. Then someone laughed. Not a full laugh, but that short, involuntary sound that escapes when something seems absurd. Douglas was the first to speak. $200, he repeated with a half-smile. Is that a piece of land or a parking space? Some laughter. Attorney Meade did not smile. The record is old, he said. The cadastral classification has not been updated in decades. There is no registered structure, no history of commercial use, no documented practical utility. Basically, it's a field, said Patricia, a second cousin, without looking up from her phone. It costs more to get there than it's worth, said Douglas. Then he turned to Attorney Meade, with the efficiency of someone who had already made up his mind. What is the procedure for renunciation? Attorney Meade explained. It was straightforward. Each heir initialed the corresponding line, signed, and the share would be redistributed or liquidated as the others agreed. Douglas signed first, with the pen he had brought, his own, metal, the kind of pen used to sign important things. He passed the document along. One by one, the others signed, some without reading, some giving it a quick glance before scrawling their names. When the document reached Vivian, Douglas was already checking something on his phone. "Vivian, you just need to sign on the dotted line," he said without looking up, the tone of someone wrapping up a formality. Vivian looked at the dotted line. Then she looked at the document. Then she stayed still for a moment that lasted long enough for Douglas to look up. "Is there a problem?" he asked. "No," she said. "It's literally $200, said Douglas, with the mildly forced patience of someone explaining the obvious. "Less than you'll spend on gas to get there. Not to mention that properties with outdated records in Harwick County likely have rural property tax arrears that will exceed the declared value. You'd be taking on a liability, not an asset." Vivian listened to all of it. It was a reasonable analysis. Douglas was not wrong. He was being exactly what he had always been, a man who understood numbers and contracts and had no patience for what could not be translated into objective value. She knew that reasoning well. She had grown up surrounded by it. But 3 weeks earlier, 2 days before he died, Ernest had asked her to come closer to the bed. He had held her hand with a strength that was surprising for a man of 86, and had said, in a low and completely clear voice, "Vivian, go take a look." Just that. No explanation. No context. She had waited for more, and he had closed his eyes with that specific expression of his. Not of exhaustion, but of someone who had said enough and knew it. She picked up a pen. Not Douglas's, her own. An ordinary pen from the bottom of her bag. And where the dotted line waited for her renunciation, she signed her full name in steady letters and said, "I'll keep it." Douglas looked at her for 1 second. Then he shrugged with the naturalness of someone who had mentally filed that away as a harmless eccentricity, retrieved his own pen, and went back to his phone. "All right," he said. "It's yours." Vivian folded the copy of the document that Attorney Meade handed her, put it in her bag, and said nothing more. She drove home in the afternoon light thinking about a phrase Ernest used to say when she was a child, and came back from somewhere with an opinion already formed, without having paid attention to what was actually around her. He would say it with a slightly ironic calm. Most people decide what something is worth before they've really looked at it. She had heard it so many times that she had stopped truly listening. That evening, sitting at her kitchen table with the folded document beside her coffee cup, she heard it again. She couldn't explain why. She left the following morning, a Wednesday, with the address written on a piece of paper and a full tank of gas. 150 miles was a drive of just under 3 hours through country roads, and she spent most of it in silence, without music, letting the landscape shift gradually from suburb to open field. The trees grew taller. The houses grew sparser. The roads grew narrower. She did not know what she expected to find. An empty field, perhaps. A lot overgrown with weeds. Perhaps the tax arrears Douglas had mentioned. Some notice nailed to a post. Some sign that the property had been forgotten, not by accident, but by necessity. The GPS took her down a secondary road of uneven asphalt, then a gravel stretch, then indicated she should turn left onto a lane flanked by tall cypress trees. She turned. The lane became a stone path, narrow but paved, that began to climb gently. Vivian stopped the car. Ahead of her, the stone path descended to an old arched bridge over a river running quietly through the valley below, then climbed back up the far side in wide curves through dense trees and vegetation. And at the top of the hill to her right, where she had expected to find perhaps a barn or a simple structure, there was a castle. Not a symbolic ruin, not a solitary wall covered in ivy. A castle of aged pale stone, with clustered towers, crenellated ramparts, a central dome and buttressed walls that rose from the hillside as if they had grown there on their own. Immense, silent, so unexpected in that valley that for a moment Vivian thought she had taken a wrong turn. She stood with her left hand resting on the stone pillar beside the path, looking. The afternoon sun caught the pale stones and turned them almost gold. A bird passed above the towers without hurry. Ernest had asked her to go take a look, and she had looked. Most people decide what something is worth before they've really looked at it. She heard it now the way she had never heard it before. Vivian took a breath, picked up her bag, stepped out of the car, and began walking down. She crossed the arched bridge on foot, the river running cold and clear beneath it, and climbed the stone path on the far side slowly, stopping twice, not from exhaustion, but because the castle kept revealing itself in layers as she ascended, and each new angle made it larger than the one before. What had looked like 2 towers from the road was 4. What had looked like a single wall was a succession of them, staggered along the hillside at different heights, connected by covered passages and narrow staircases carved directly into the rock. The central dome, which she had seen from a distance as a simple rounded roof, was ribbed and detailed up close, its stone darkened by decades of weather into a deep charcoal gray that contrasted with the paler walls below it. The main entrance was a wide arched gate set between 2 of the larger towers, its heavy wooden doors weathered but intact, bound with iron that had rusted to a deep amber. Beside the gate, almost invisible beneath a curtain of ivy that had claimed most of the left tower's lower wall, there was a smaller door, arched as well, made of darker wood, standing very slightly ajar. Vivian noticed it the way you notice something that does not quite fit. The ivy around its frame had been disturbed recently, some of it pulled back, a few stems broken cleanly rather than withered. Someone had opened that door not long ago. She was still looking at it when a voice came from behind her. "Didn't think anyone was coming." She turned. A man was standing at the edge of the path, about 20 feet away, holding a canvas bag in one hand and a thermos in the other. He was somewhere in his late 40s, lean in the way of people who have spent years working outdoors rather than in a gym, with a face that had been in the sun long enough to show it. He wore a flannel shirt, work trousers, and boots that had seen considerable use. He did not look alarmed to see her. He looked, if anything, mildly relieved. "Thomas Aldrin," he said, walking toward her with the unhurried ease of someone on familiar ground. "I own the property next over. Have for about 11 years now." "Vivian Whitfield," she said. "Ernest was my grandfather." Thomas stopped walking. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. The way a face changes when a piece of information lands in a place that was already waiting for it. "Whitfield," he said. He talked about the family sometimes. A brief pause. He didn't say who was coming, just that someone would, eventually. Vivian looked at him. "You knew he was going to leave it to someone." "I knew he wasn't going to sell it," Thomas said, which meant at some point it was going to pass to somebody. He set the canvas bag down on a flat stone beside the path and unscrewed the thermos. "You want coffee? I was just doing the rounds on the fence line when I saw your car." She accepted the coffee because it was cold on the hill, and because something about the offer felt like the beginning of a conversation she needed to have. They sat on a low stone wall near the gate, the valley laid out below them in the afternoon light. And Thomas talked the way people talk when they have been holding information for a long time and are finally in front of the right person. He had bought his property about 11 years earlier, an old farmstead on the eastern edge of the valley. Ernest had been his neighbor from the beginning. Not a talkative man, Thomas said, but a consistent one. He came to the castle every few months, sometimes staying for a week at a time, always alone, always working on something inside that he never fully explained. They had shared fence-line conversations over the years, the kind that start about weather and land and slowly become about other things. He told me once that 3 different buyers had approached him over the years, Thomas said, turning the thermos cap in his hands. First one was a property developer, wanted to tear it down and build a resort. That was back in the 90s. Ernest sent him away in about 4 minutes. He paused. Second one was a foreign investment fund. They came with a formal offer. I don't know the exact number, but Ernest told me it was enough to retire on 5 times over. He didn't even finish reading the letter. Vivian was quiet for a moment. And the third? A historical preservation group actually wanted to restore it, keep it intact. Legitimate organization, good intentions. He met with them twice. Thomas looked toward the castle. Still said no. The wind moved through the cypress trees at the bottom of the path. Vivian turned the coffee cup in her hands and thought about a man who had refused to sell something that sat on his books for 50 years as a $200 property. Not because he hadn't been offered real money, not because he hadn't understood the offers, but because he had said no, specifically and repeatedly, to each one. Did he ever say why? She asked. Thomas considered this for a moment with the seriousness of someone who had asked himself the same question more than once. He said the place already had an owner, Thomas said, just that they didn't know it yet. Vivian set the coffee cup down on the wall beside her. She spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the castle with Thomas, who had a key to the smaller door. Ernest had given it to him years ago, asked him to check on the place periodically, make sure the roof held and the lower rooms stayed dry. The interior was dim and cool, the air carrying that particular stillness of enclosed stone, and Vivian moved through it slowly, letting her eyes adjust. The main hall was vast, its ceiling arched and intact, the flagstone floor uneven but solid. There were no furnishings to speak of. A wooden table in one of the side rooms, a few shelves, the kind of sparse arrangement that suggested the space had been used for storage or work rather than living. Thomas pointed out the structural features as they moved through, the thickness of the walls, the quality of the original stonework, the way the drainage channels carved into the floor of the lower level had kept the foundations dry for what must have been well over a century. He had the eye of someone trained to see buildings as systems rather than surfaces. He told her he had spent 23 years as a civil engineer before retiring early to the valley, and that when he had first walked through the castle at Ernest's invitation, he had spent 2 hours in the lower level alone, just looking. In terms of structure, Thomas said, running a hand along one of the interior walls, this is in better shape than buildings a third of its age that people are actively maintaining. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. There was a door at the far end of the main hall that was not like the others. The other interior doors were wooden, worn, some of them warped slightly in their frames. This one was heavier, its wood darker and denser, and it was fitted with a lock that was not old, relatively new, in fact, installed at some point in the past decade or two, its metal still clean. Thomas did not have a key for it. "Never asked about it," he said, looking at the door with an expression that suggested he had thought about it more than once. Ernest mentioned it exactly one time, said there were things inside that needed to stay dry and undisturbed until the right moment. Vivian stood in front of the door for a long time. She pressed her palm flat against the wood, which was cool and absolutely solid. Behind it, whatever Ernest had decided needed to wait was still waiting. She photographed the door with her phone. Then she photographed the lock. Then she turned around and walked back through the hall toward the late afternoon light, coming through the arched entrance. Outside, The sun was lower now, the shadows of the towers stretching long and precise across the hillside. Vivian stood at the top of the stone path and looked down at the valley, the river, the bridge, the cypress trees, the road where her car was parked. From up here, the scale of the property was clearer than it had been from the road. 32 acres was not a field. It was a valley, a hillside, a river bend, a castle, and something locked behind a door that Ernest had specifically chosen not to explain. Most people decide what something is worth before they've really looked at it. She had heard her grandfather say that her entire life. Standing on that hillside, she understood for the first time that he had not been talking about property. Thomas walked her back to her car as the light faded. At the bridge, he stopped. "There's a woman in town you should probably talk to," he said. "Her name is Ruth Haynes. She's retired now, but she practiced law in this county for 40 years. She and Ernest." He paused, choosing the word carefully. "They went back a long way. I don't know exactly what she knows, but Ernest mentioned her name to me once in a context that made me think she knew more about this place than I do." He looked at Vivian directly. I think he expected someone to eventually ask her. Vivian wrote the name in her phone. She drove back to the nearest town as darkness settled over the valley, checked into a small inn on the main street, and sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on, looking at the photograph of the locked door on her phone screen. Somewhere in this county, a 70-year-old retired attorney had been waiting, possibly for years, for a Whitfield to show up and ask the right question. And somewhere in the valley behind her, behind a door with a relatively new lock in an ancient castle that had been listed in a legal document as being worth $200, Ernest had left something that he had described, to the only neighbor who ever asked, as needing to wait until the right moment. Vivian set the phone down on the nightstand and lay back on the bed, without taking off her coat. The ceiling was white and unremarkable above her. She thought about Douglas signing first, without hesitation, with his own pen. She thought about the way he had explained, patiently, reasonably, correctly, why she should do the same. She thought about Ernest's hand holding hers 2 days before he died, stronger than it had any right to be. Go take a look. She had looked, and now she understood that looking had only been the first part. Ruth Haynes lived on a quiet street 3 blocks from the county courthouse, in a house that suited her in the way that certain houses suit certain people. Not because it was impressive, but because it was exactly what it needed to be. A white clapboard front, a porch with 2 wooden chairs, a garden along the left side that was clearly tended by someone who understood plants rather than someone who simply maintained them. Vivian had called that morning, Thursday, from the inn, and Ruth had answered on the second ring and said, without any particular surprise, to come at 10. She was 70 years old and looked like a woman who had spent 4 decades in courtrooms. Not hard, but precise. Silver hair cut short and practical, dark eyes that moved with the habit of assessment, hands that stayed still in her lap when she talked, rather than gesturing. She poured coffee without asking, and set a plate of something homemade on the table between them. And then she sat down and looked at Vivian with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was close to one. "You must be the one who didn't sign," she said. Vivian looked at her. "Ernest told you about the inventory?" "Ernest told me about you," Ruth said. "Not recently, over the years." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "He talked about the family the way people talk about weather. You can't change it, and you learn to read it. But when he talked about you, the tone was different." She paused. "He said you were the one who paid attention to things." The morning light came through the kitchen window at a low angle and fell across the table between them. Vivian waited. Ruth had met Ernest Whitfield 41 years earlier, in 1985, when he had walked into her office with a deed, a survey map, and a problem that she described, looking back, as one of the most unusual she had encountered in her career. Ernest had purchased the castle property in 1973, 12 years before he came to see her, through a private sale from a family that had owned it since the early 1900s, and before that traced ownership back through a succession of transfers that went further than anyone had bothered to research. He had paid $11,000 for it, cash, which was already considerably below any reasonable market estimate even at that time, because the family had simply wanted it gone. They had inherited it from someone who had inherited it from someone else, and no one in the line had known what to do with it. And the carrying costs and tax obligations had become a quiet source of embarrassment. Ernest had paid the $11,000, taken the deed, and done nothing visible with the property for 12 years. Then he had gone to see Ruth. He came in with a box of documents, Ruth said. Original deeds, transfer records, survey notes going back to the late 1800s, correspondence between previous owners and county officials, some of it in terrible condition. He had spent those 12 years going through them, methodically, the way Ernest did everything. What was he looking for? Vivian asked. He wasn't looking for anything specific, Ruth said. He was reading. And when you read carefully enough, you find things. She set down her coffee cup. What he found took me the better part of a year to verify. What Ernest had found, buried in the succession of transfers and the correspondence between previous owners and a county land office that no longer existed, was a deed restriction and a preservation covenant recorded in 1912 by the original builder's estate. A covenant that had never been formally dissolved, had never been contested in court, and had, in the decades of inattentive ownership that followed, simply been forgotten. The covenant established that the property in its entirety, the land, the structure, and the water rights associated with the river bend, could never be subdivided, partially sold, or structurally altered without unanimous agreement of all legal heirs of the original builder's line, of which there were none remaining. That clause, Ruth explained carefully, was the mechanism. Because with no surviving heirs to the covenant's originating family, the restriction had a specific legal consequence that Ernest had identified and that she had spent months confirming. Under the county land code of that era, a preservation covenant with no surviving enforcement party and no dissolution record transferred its protective status to the registered owner of record at the time the absence of heirs was formally established, Ruth said. Ernest filed the necessary documentation with the county in 1987. It took 2 years to process. But when it was done, the castle and its land were designated a protected historical property under his ownership, not the counties, not the states, with all the associated rights. Vivian was quiet for a moment. What rights? Ruth looked at her steadily. The right to apply for federal historical preservation funding, which Ernest never did. The right to charge admission, conduct educational programs, license the property for cultural use. None of which he did either. She paused. And the right to receive annual compensation from the County Historical Trust for maintaining a property of significant historical value in private hands, which is a provision that was written into county code in 1961 and has never been repealed. He never collected it, Vivian said. It was not a question. He never collected it, Ruth confirmed. The account has been accumulating for 37 years. I have the statements. She said it simply, without drama, the way you state a fact that has been sitting in a filing cabinet waiting for the right moment. He also maintained the cadastral value at $200 deliberately by filing a specific exemption request every 5 years under the historical protection status. It was perfectly legal. It kept the property off any meaningful radar. Vivian thought about Douglas at the head of the table, explaining with complete confidence that the $200 valuation reflected the property's actual worth. She thought about the reasonableness of his voice, the patience with which he had outlined the liabilities. He had been so certain, and he had been working entirely from the surface of things, which was the only place Douglas had ever looked. He kept the value low on purpose, Vivian said. He kept it low because it was accurate under the exemption, Ruth said carefully. The cadastral value and the actual value are two entirely different things. Ernest understood that distinction very well. A brief pause. Anyone who had taken the time to pull the full record would have understood it too. No one had pulled the full record. No one had gone to see the property. No one had driven 150 miles on a Wednesday morning because an 86-year-old man had asked them to, without explaining why, 2 days before he died. Ruth stood and went to a cabinet in the hallway, returning with a manila folder that was old but well preserved, its edges reinforced with tape that had yellowed over time. She set it on the table in front of Vivian. "He left this with me 19 years ago," she said. "He told me to give it to whoever came from his family to ask about the property. He said," she paused, and for the first time something in her expression shifted from precise to something warmer. "He said that if nobody came, to donate it to the County Historical Archive, but that he didn't think it would come to that." Inside the folder were 3 things: a complete copy of the Preservation Covenant documentation and county filings, a set of current financial statements from the County Historical Trust, and a sealed envelope with Vivian's name written on it in handwriting she recognized immediately. The same careful, unhurried script that had written her name on birthday cards and letters for as long as she could remember. She did not open it there. She held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the slight weight of whatever was inside, and then she placed it carefully on top of the documents and closed the folder. "The accumulated compensation," Vivian said. "Can you tell me the amount?" Ruth told her. Vivian looked at the number for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. The way you nod when something confirms what part of you already suspected, but another part of you had not quite allowed yourself to believe. "And Douglas," she said. "He filed the renunciation. Is it final?" "He signed voluntarily in the presence of a licensed attorney after being given the opportunity to review the estate documents," Ruth said. The precision in her voice had returned completely. "He is an attorney himself. The renunciation is unambiguous and entirely final." A brief pause. "I imagine he will test that conclusion when he finds out." "When he finds out," Vivian said. "He already knows you came," Ruth said. "Thomas mentioned it to someone in town yesterday, the way people do in small places. Word travels." She looked at Vivian with the directness of someone who has spent 40 years reading situations accurately. "You should expect a call." Vivian's phone had been face down in her bag since she arrived. She did not turn it over. She drove back to the castle that afternoon, parked at the top of the stone path, and sat in the car for a while before getting out. The valley below was quiet in the early afternoon light, the river catching the sun in slow-moving pieces, the cypress trees along the lane standing perfectly still. She had the key Thomas had lent her that morning. He had handed it over without being asked, as if he had been waiting for the natural moment to do so. She walked down the path, crossed the bridge, climbed the hill, and went through the smaller door into the cool stillness of the castle. She walked through the main hall without stopping, and stood again in front of the locked door at the far end. Then she took the key from her coat pocket. Not Thomas's key, but the small, old key she had found that morning inside the manila folder, which Ruth had handed to her without comment, and she fit it into the lock, and the lock opened. The room behind the door was not large. It was a square chamber with a low vaulted ceiling, its walls lined with wooden shelving that Ernest had built himself. She could tell by the joinery, careful and functional, the same way he built everything. On the shelves were boxes, each one labeled in his handwriting, each one sealed against moisture with the kind of methodical attention that spoke of someone who had planned for a long time to be gone. A work table ran along the far wall, its surface clean and bare except for a single lamp, unplugged, and a wooden chair pushed neatly underneath. The room smelled of cedar and old paper and something else she could not name, something that reminded her of his house, of Sunday afternoons in his kitchen, of a person who was no longer anywhere and yet was somehow entirely present in this room. Vivian stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she walked in, sat down in the wooden chair, and opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages, written in the same unhurried script as her name on the front. Ernest had never been a brief man when he wrote. He believed, as he had told her once, that a letter worth sending was worth finishing properly. She read it slowly, from the beginning, without skipping ahead. He began with the castle itself. He had found it listed in a county record that he had stumbled upon while researching something entirely unrelated in the summer of 1972. He had driven out to see it on a Tuesday afternoon in August, alone, with no particular expectation. He described standing at the top of the stone path and seeing it for the first time, the towers, the dome, the way it sat on the hillside as if it had decided to be there long before anyone thought to build it. And he wrote that he had stood there for a considerable time before walking down, because some things require a moment before you move toward them. He had purchased it the following spring. He wrote about the 12 years of reading, the documents, the covenant, the thing he found buried under decades of inattention. He wrote about Ruth and the 2 years of legal work, and the morning the county confirmation had arrived in his mailbox, which he described simply as one of the better mornings of his life. He wrote about the offers he had refused, the developer, the investment fund, the preservation group, and he was candid about why. It was not that he distrusted their intentions, he wrote. It was that none of them had come to see it the way he had come to see it. They had sent appraisers and analysts and representatives with folders of projections, and every one of those people had walked through the castle looking for what it could become, rather than understanding what it already was. He had nothing against ambition or development or even profit. He had something against the specific blindness of people who look at a thing and see only its conversion value. Then he wrote about the family. He was not unkind. He was precise, which in some ways was more difficult to read. He wrote that he loved his grandchildren in the way that grandparents love, without condition, and therefore without illusion. He knew who they were. He had watched them for decades with the patience of someone who is not in a hurry to be disappointed and is also not surprised when they are. Douglas he described as a man of genuine intelligence applied entirely to the surface of things, which was both his greatest professional asset and the specific limitation that had cost him, in the end, the thing that mattered. He did not write this with satisfaction. He wrote it the way you write a diagnosis. And then he wrote about Vivian. She had to stop at the end of the second page and look up at the shelves for a moment before continuing. He wrote that he had watched her, over the years, do something that most people in the family had never learned to do. She paid attention before she decided. Not slowly, not hesitantly. She was not an uncertain person, but she did not mistake the label for the contents. He had seen her do it with people, with situations, with the small daily decisions that reveal character more reliably than the large ones. He wrote that she had been underestimated by the family for as long as he had observed it. and that this had grieved him in the particular way that things grieve you when you can see them clearly and cannot change them. He wrote, "I needed it to go to someone who would go look before deciding what it was worth. I knew that if the number on the paper was small enough, most of them would not bother. I knew you would go because I asked you to. I did not know what you would do once you got there, but I knew you would look at it the way it deserved to be looked at. That was enough for me." And then, near the bottom of the 3rd page, one line that she read 3 times. "The castle was never the inheritance, Vivian. The inheritance was being the kind of person who goes to sea." She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time after she finished it. The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a wind had come up, and she could hear it moving through the cypress trees at the bottom of the path, a slow, traveling sound that came and went in waves. She did not cry exactly, but there was something behind her eyes that required a few minutes to settle. When she came back out through the main hall and into the afternoon light, she found Thomas sitting on the low stone wall near the gate with his thermos, as if he had simply happened to be there, which she suspected was not entirely accidental. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and she wanted to say it out loud once, "He was a very deliberate man." Thomas considered this with his characteristic unhurried seriousness. "He was the most deliberate man I've ever met," he said. "I used to think it was stubbornness. Took me a few years to understand the difference." Her phone had 7 missed calls from Douglas. She had seen them in the car on the way back from Ruth's and had put the phone face down again. Now she picked it up, stood in the courtyard of the castle that was hers, and called him back. He answered before the 2nd ring. "Vivian." His voice had the particular quality of a man who is controlling something carefully. "I've been trying to reach you." "I know," she said. "I've been looking into the property," he said. "There are some aspects of the estate record that weren't fully represented in the inventory documentation. I think there may be grounds to revisit the distribution, given that material information was—" "Douglas," she said. He stopped. "You conducted the inventory," she said. "You had access to the same county records I did. You had the deed, the cadastral history, the full registration record. You are an attorney with 30 years of experience." She kept her voice level and even, not cold, simply factual. "You signed voluntarily in the presence of Attorney Meade, after explaining to me personally and in detail why I should do the same." A silence on the line. "The renunciation is final," she said. "Ruth Haynes has the complete documentation. If you'd like to proceed formally, she'll be ready for you." Another silence. Longer. When Douglas spoke again, something in his voice had shifted. The controlled quality was still there, but underneath it, something had given way, and what was left was almost, something honest. "You knew," he said, "before you signed. You knew something." "No," she said, and this was entirely true. "I didn't know anything. I just went to look." She ended the call and stood in the courtyard for a moment, her phone in her hand, the castle rising on 3 sides around her. The legal process that Ruth had already quietly set in motion would take several months to complete. The activation of the historical trust compensation, the formal registration of the preservation rights under her name, the documentation that confirmed what had been accumulating in that county account for 37 years, undisturbed, while a $200 property sat in a file that no one had thought worth examining. Douglas retained a lawyer of his own within the week, as Ruth had predicted, and that lawyer reviewed the same documents that Ruth had spent 40 years understanding, and arrived at the same conclusion that anyone arriving honestly at the facts was compelled to reach. The renunciation was unambiguous, voluntary, and final. The matter closed without a hearing. None of that was the part that stayed with Vivian. What stayed was a Thursday afternoon in October, 3 weeks after she had first driven down that country road with an address on a piece of paper and no particular expectation. She had come back to the castle to begin the slow work of understanding what she now had and what she intended to do with it. And she had parked at the top of the stone path and gotten out of the car and stood there for a moment before starting down. The valley was moving into autumn. The cypress trees had not changed, but the vegetation along the hillside had deepened into amber and rust, and the river in the valley caught the light differently than it had in October, more silver now, less gold. The castle on the hill looked exactly as it had the first time she had seen it. Immense, quiet, improbably present in that landscape, as if it had been waiting for something for a very long time, and had developed a particular patience about it. She stood at the top of the path with her hand resting on the stone pillar, the same way she had stood the first time, and she thought about a man who had driven out to see something on a Tuesday afternoon in August with no particular expectation, and had stood in this same spot, and had looked, and had understood something that all the appraisers and analysts and people with folders of projections had never managed to understand. Most people decide what something is worth before they've really looked at it. She had heard it as a child and filed it away as one of those things that adults say and mean loosely. She understood now that Ernest had never said anything loosely in his life. He had said that specific thing in that specific way because he had spent decades watching a specific pattern repeat itself in property records and in family dinners and in the small daily transactions between people who had learned to price everything before examining it. And he had wanted at least one person in his life to hear it the way he meant it. She picked up her bag and started down the stone path toward the castle. The wind came through the cypress trees in a long, slow wave, and then settled. The valley was very quiet, and somewhere at the bottom of the path, behind an arched bridge over a river that had been running through that valley since long before anyone had thought to build anything on the hill above it, the most deliberate man she had ever known was waiting, in the only way the dead can wait, to see what she would do next. Ernest spent years watching people walk past something extraordinary because the number attached to it was too small to earn their attention. And in the end, he didn't leave Vivian a castle. He left her a confirmation of something she had always been and never quite been given credit for. The kind of person who goes to see. That's the inheritance that can't be signed away. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories are reaching. Thank you for the company.